little girls, this seems to say, never stop upon your way, never trust a stranger friend. No one knows how it will end. As you're pretty, so be wise. Wolves may lurk in every guise. Now, as then, 'tis simple truth. Sweetest tongue has sharpest tooth.
Hi everybody, and welcome to B007 Movie Reviews, where today we are discussing, I guess, what I would consider to be a pantheon movie, which is Neil Jordan's 1984 gothic horror classic, Company of Wolves. And today I am joined by Matthieu, who you may know from the Lord of the Rings Extended Edition DVD commentaries. So hi Matthieu, thanks for joining.
Thanks. Hi everybody.
So you actually suggested we talk about this movie. So is this a favourite of yours? Is this a movie that you love? Why did you want to revisit this classic?
Yeah, because I wanted to talk about this one specifically because I think this is one of those. I wouldn't say. I mean, I would hate to call it, an adult fairy tale film. I mean, it's sort of like Pan's Labyrinth in a way. I think, and that's why it's interesting to me. And I think werewolves, just in general, like you don't get a lot of good werewolf films generally. So I thought, this was the ideal one actually. So I mean, to me, it's always like the atmosphere and everything. It has all that gothic stuff that you want. Not necessarily. It's not a horror film in the way that other blood and gore stuff is. So I enjoy it on that level. Because it talks about sexuality and growing up and all that stuff. It's all very interesting. It's also visually very unique in that sense because it's not necessarily you're not sure if it's a linear film or not. So I really
it's almost definitely not, right? I mean, it's a really fascinating structure, which is almost like some of those Russian dolls where it has a framing device and then you keep on going deeper and deeper and peeling back stories, and there are stories within stories. So it's structured, I think, really complex. For those of you who haven't seen the movie, we are going to talk about it in depth, so it would probably be better if you watched it before listening to this. That said, given that the Company of Wolves is based on the Little Red Riding Hood fairy tale, I guess in a sense there's not much to spoil, because really what this movie does is it just unpacks the sort of sexual and Freudian implications of that fairy tale.
Yeah, and it's also, the one of the writers of the screenplay also wrote the book this was based on, Angela Carter. The film actually takes it's basically the book that the film is based on is The Bloody Chamber, which is sort of a collection of short stories, and some of them are related to werewolves. And yeah, those short stories are basically what this film version is based on. But I'm just gonna say very quickly what the author tried to do with the original book, because it's interesting to note the difference. She said, "My intention was not to do versions, or as the American edition of the book said horribly, adult fairy tales, but to extract the latent content from the traditional stories." So I think that, maybe there's a difference to, calling something an adult fairy tale and maybe saying that, the essence of the folklore is preserved within the story. So as to make it interesting for not just children, because Disney in a way has sort of created the idea that fairy tales are for a younger public when they're not necessarily. So
yeah, the whole fairy tale concept, if you go back to the Brothers Grimm and all those tales, they're all very dark and disgusting in some ways, and deal with all this stuff. I feel kind of Angela Carter's just taking back to the origins of the fairy tale, which are these very, very dark and laden with morality and sort of the sexual mores of their time that they were written, which can tend to be very oppressive and misogynistic. Lots of fear of modernity, lots of fear of female sexuality. So they are, I think, or Angela Carter's just taking us back to that rather than the very sort of light and bright confections that are Disney cartoons. So from that respect, I think she's almost just back to basics, really. So the movie, actually, I was surprised to find, well, I think it's an hour and 20 minutes. Matthieu thinks it's an hour and 30 minutes, so there's obviously some kind of version confusion out there. It is 1984. It's a colour film directed by Neil Jordan, who went on to do Interview with a Vampire, as well as TV's The Borgias. So a guy who has done lots of gothic stuff, but he's also done a lot of movies that are to do with sexuality and conflict. So he famously did The Crying Game, which I won't say more about, because if you don't know the twist at the end, that tells you all about the conflicted sexuality in it. But he deals with these movies that have layered politics and layered sexual politics, as well as a fascination with the Gothic. And this was his second movie, I think, so he absolutely comes at it with a very strong record. But let's get into just discussing what's going on. So, as we peel back the layers of this film, it starts off in what looks to be contemporary England, where a young girl where two parents and a sister drive up in a modern car, to what looks like a very old-fashioned house. And the girl kind of seems to be dressed a little bit Victorian-like, and she runs into house to sort of knock on the door of her younger sister, Rosaline, who's having what seems to be a nightmare. And then we're taken into the world of the nightmare, which is the younger girl dreaming of her older sister being chased in a sort of, I don't know, a dark Gothic wood by wolves, and there's lots of old Victorian children's toys. And it's all, and it goes on for quite some time, actually. It's about 10 minutes long, and it's just this very surreal, kind of quite challenging opening to a film, but with this quite 80s synthesizer heavy score by George Fenton. When you saw it the first time, were you shocked at like how long that scene took, or how intense it was? I think it threw a lot of people who were watching it at the cinema at the time.
No, I wasn't bothered by it I wasn't bothered by it in any way. I just went with it. Maybe it's because I'm predisposed to liking this sort of story. Because I'm, all that Gothic creature stuff, werewolves and so on, is just inherently interesting to me. So, I just went with it because I thought this is visually very, very compelling. The dolls, like the pretty picture, but empty inside.
There is something very sinister, isn't there, about those Victorian children's dolls? I was thinking when I watched it today earlier that it's a little bit like if you watch the Hammer horror remakes of The Woman in Black, so the first one starring Daniel Radcliffe and the remake, they use a lot of that kind of iconography of the sinister Victorian children's toys. And also this kind of... She's surrounded.
I think she's also surrounded in the room by all these dolls. There's one that looks like, the grandma figure in the film. So
yeah, absolutely. And it's also, I think it sort of hints at... there's a very rich strain in that Hammer House horror movie kind of genre of paedophobia, so the fear of children or children's kind of unboundaried existence, like they haven't been oppressed into their little social roles yet. So that's kind of nice. But as we come out of this dream, we're suddenly not in the contemporary world anymore. We're back in what feels like a sort of maybe an 18th century or 19th century woodland scene.
I think 16th, 17th century probably.
Yeah, a bit earlier than that. And then it feels like the elder sister has died and the little sister now is attending the funeral, and she's sent to stay with her granny, who's played by Angela Lansbury.
And Murder, She Wrote.
Yeah, and really funny because she always plays these really sort of lovable, wise women, and then here she's this kind of slightly sinister woman with a dodgy Northern Irish accent.
She has a weird ferret on the wall, like it's like sometimes it hisses and stuff like that. It's really weird. But yeah, she's actually that's the thing. Most of the I don't recognize the actress, the main girl, from anything else, but
she didn't really do much else. Her name's Sarah Pattinson, and she just sort of disappeared after this, which is rather sad.
Yeah, but it's nice to see at least one. There are two actors or three actors that I recognize from something else in this film, but not main characters. They're not sort of. And I sort of think that's also why it's interesting, because sometimes when you have a famous actor, it takes you out of the film. This definitely does not, because you can.
That's true.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this granny is a little bit like old Nan. She's full of wisdom, and most of it's very oppressive. So, as she takes little Rosaline to her cottage, she gives her all these sort of warnings about not straying from the path, because if you stray from the path, you're evidently going to end up in ways of wickedness. And she has this lovely line about the fact that not all wolves have their fur on the outside, and not falling for men who have, or trusting men who have their eyebrows joined together.
Yeah, that's definitely something, that's actually real. Like when you had, there were some witch trials, werewolf trials in the 15th, 16th century. And, when you had like hairy, hands or something like that, or you had a unibrow or something like that, you were definitely suspect in a way. So that's definitely taken from the folklore. And I think that what I also admire is that, the film manages to work all these things in, rather easily, because usually when you have a vampire film or a werewolf film, they make up the rules for the film itself, right? They don't stick to what is traditional folklore and traditional myths and that sort of thing. And here the film actually does.
Absolutely. So in the first illustration of bestiality, or the dangers of male bestiality, you have, while Granny is knitting Little Red Riding Hood her red cape, she tells her of a story of a woman who was married to a man, and on their wedding night he goes out basically to take a piss and never comes back, except that obviously he comes back. Everyone thinks he's been devoured by a wolf, right? And then she later gets married to the guy who plays the butler out of Downton Abbey. And,
he plays the inspector in V for Vendetta, doesn't he?
Oh yeah, that's true. I totally forgot about that. Anyway, so Jim Carter, who by the way is a great cricket fan. Anyway, so she later marries him, and on their wedding night, not on their wedding night, the old husband returns and is just obviously deeply upset that she's now remarried and has kids and whatnot. And he transforms into a wolf, which I think is probably one of the most famous scenes of the film.
Yeah, because he rips the skin off, right? It's like it's really weird, because the transformations they're not consistent in the film, which I like also, because it suggests that it's something magical and not unknowable. It's like really it depends. It's really strange and you cannot understand it. And
although, have you seen it recently though, the animatronic scene?
Yeah, I noticed that you can see the effects, but I appreciate that it was practical. Because
I think it's the shame actually.
Very easy to spot.
It sort of it lets it down, because I think at the time it was probably incredibly pioneering. But it's one of the reasons why, as much as I love this film, I think if you didn't already love it, like if you were just a young person watching it now, I think it wouldn't hold up for that reason, because it does look a bit hokey. But then again, there's this wonderful iconography where when the new husband basically kills the wolf by chopping off his head, and there's a scene where this kind of it's a very slithery, sort of shiny, sort of muscular head in a way. It's weird, and it falls into this vat of milk, which I'm not entirely sure what's doing there. But there.
So, what happens is essentially the head turns human, and the implication is probably you have white and red mixing up together.
Yeah, I think it's the kind of the bestial, revengeful nature versus this kind of Christian purity. But it's all about. It reminded me of Park Chan-wook films, especially Lady Vengeance, which has lots of red and white contrasting visuals in it. So yeah, I really love that scene, even though the animatronics is a little bit hokey.
But we get a different transformation later on in the film that is not as hokey, I think.
Yeah, this is true.
And yeah, I just find it really interesting, that after he chops off the head, he slaps the wife, basically.
Yeah.
She said, he was just the way I married, just like the day I married him, and it's like, yeah, well, it's sort of meant to probably be it's sort of meant to convey that men keeping the women down in some way.
Yeah, for sure, because the men, she's both threatened by the bestial nature of the man, but also saved by the kind of murderous nature of another man.
Yes.
So the woman is just caught between violence and sexual predatory nature. I mean, it's a pretty dull lookout. So that's Granny's horrific story with which she's scaring little Rosaline to death. But anyway, so the next day, Rosaline goes into the village, which is now the medieval or late medieval village, and she's flirting with a village boy who wants her to walk with him on Sunday, Sunday, the day of religious purity.
Yeah.
And he actually says to her, literally, "I promise you, we won't stray from the path."
Well,
yeah,
you got to work that in some way. But it's true. Like that's sort of the implication. I think when I showed the film to my mother, she wasn't really impressed by it because she thought, well, all that sexuality stuff is very much. I mean, the visual imagery is very much the 80s in a way. She says, this is sort of the sexual awakening imagery that you probably have seen a couple of times by now. But yeah, I think putting it in this context is new because you wouldn't expect that from a fairy tale setting necessarily. So,
well, you certainly don't expect the next scene, which is something, I guess, a very much a rite of passage thing, whereas little Rosaline hears her parents having sex, and she has this really bizarre conversation with her mother the next morning where she asks if her father hurts her, and then her mum has this brilliant line where she says, "There's a beast in man, but it meets its match in women," which I don't think we really see until the very end of the film, but it's kind of nice to see that after this horrific story about the wolf man, that the mother's actually saying that, well, a woman can own her own sexuality, and that is a powerful thing, as opposed to the grandmother's kind of warning stories about how you should fear your own sexuality, I guess.
Yeah, that's also, you have different observations about the role of sex in society, where the grandmother is, because she's the older person, the elderly woman. It's sort of meant to be like the conservative position in a way that you fear your own body, beware your own sexual desires and all that stuff. Whereas the mother of the girl is rather more understanding of she because she engages in active sex with her husband, so it's really it's a more enlightened position, I would say.
Yeah, and it's cool because it sets up the final confrontation.
Yeah.
So we'll get to that, I guess, when we get to it. And so this, so despite the fact that Mum's giving some decent advice, around that, Granny then tells yet another, like, horrifically misogynistic and prejudicial story in which apparently if a priest has a bastard son born with his feet first on Christmas Day with eyebrows that meet in the middle, he's predestined to meet the devil in the woods. And brilliantly, the devil in the woods is played by Terence Stamp. So cool.
Oh yeah.
I mean, like,
he comes in a car, right? It's like weird. The devil is very modern. Like,
isn't he driving like a big Rolls Royce or something? And
he's a sort of like I don't know, some lotion or something to put on his skin, and then he sort of there's some tree. I think there's some trees that try to kill the boy.
It's kind of like, it's basically a tale of beware of puberty in a way. It's almost like puberty is a gift of the devil, because when he puts the lotion on the body, he starts sprouting chest hair. So not only should Rosaline be afraid of her sexuality, but even the poor boys should be afraid of their sexuality. And then it's a bit Tom Bombadil style, he gets like swallowed by the vines of the trees, and it just ends badly, basically. Granny's basically, I suppose at least she's equal opportunities down on sexuality in general, but obviously all this stuff about if the priest has a bastard and all born feet first on Christmas Day, it's just so indicative of that kind of, I guess,
superstition, right?
Yeah, small town superstition.
And it's also interesting, like, it happens in the woods, like, he's literally alone in the woods, so to speak. It's the confusion that comes with puberty and discovering your own body and that sort of thing. You're not sure what's happening, right? When you're in that process necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I'm surprised they didn't make something more overt about the myth about if you masturbate too much you go blind. I'm amazed they didn't work that in. But I guess this is much more from the girl's point of view in a sense.
Because the main characters here, everyone except the huntsman are women, so it's very very much. It doesn't necessarily need, and it also, just because the main characters are women does not necessarily mean they have to be like badasses in a way that you would probably see today, where you're basically saying, okay, because we have a female main character, we have to make it exciting for the boys as well. So let's make stuff. And yeah, this does not do that at all, because it's not that kind of film.
No, it's modern, but it's not post-modern. Put it that way. So anyway, basically, after Granny's little story, which is obviously calculated to scare Rosaline, she does in fact go with the boy for a walk into the woods, and he does try and kiss her, and she does eventually kiss him. But then she basically runs into the woods, and he chases after her. But then basically they lose each other, and when she comes back to the village, the boy discovers that a wolf has killed a cow. And it's kind of clear, it's implied that basically the boy's desires for Rosaline have probably made him manifest as a wolf and do this thing. But yeah,
the other thing that it reminds me of is the legend of the Beast of Gévaudan in France.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where you have this giant wolf that kills children, and people hunting it and stuff. I think that's sort of maybe what I get from it, because but maybe it's also because I'm aware of these kinds of legends and that sort of thing. But it has it certainly adds a level of depth that you would not necessarily expect if you weren't familiar with it. So it's
no, I agree. And then it's sort of, what I find really interesting is you get that trope that you do see in Disney films of all the villagers with pitchforks going off to try and find the wolf.
Yeah.
And then what's kind of interesting to me is that maybe as a sign of Rosaline's increasing maturity, she actually tells her mother a story. So the third story within the story is actually told by Rosaline, not by the grandma. And she tells the mum a story of how this peasant woman, who's basically being knocked up by her aristo boyfriend, returns on his wedding day and basically turns the entire wedding party into wolves. And I think it's really interesting because it almost seems to go back even further in time, so it almost feels like a scene from Amadeus. Like, it feels like a very courtly scene with very courtly music, and this very pregnant woman turns up who presumably we're meant to think is some kind of witch.
Yes, that's probably it.
Cursing everybody, I guess.
Yeah, and here we have, there's also a woman at the table who's constantly eating. And as she becomes a wolf, like, she's still eating and that sort of stuff. It's really weird. It feels like something out of The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover, right? That sort of level of disgusting in a way, because these are all meant to be animals in a way. They're behaving like animals because he's having sex with. He had sex with the witch essentially, and then he goes around, gets the next girl and that sort of thing, and they are all eating, and basically enjoying themselves far too much and that sort of thing. I think it's a really nice scene showing off
beautifully filmed, actually, in retrospect. It really does look lovely, and I do like the idea that in this story, after the story that Rosaline's mum has told her that there's a beast in women too. Suddenly, rather than Granny telling stories, it's Rosaline telling a story, and in her story, the woman ends up on top because she has the power. Like, she doesn't submit to a man's wanton cruelty, and she does explicitly call him out on that in front of everybody and has the upper hand. So I like that that's kind of in Rosaline's way of forming a narrative. She seems to be maturing. And then basically, kind of as she's told the story and comes to an end, the dad turns up with what was a wolf's paw but is now a human hand, and everyone thinks that that's the werewolf that killed her elder sister. So.
I might also just mention something that's interesting to know about the production of the film in this, because when they are transformed into wolves at the wedding, in the story that Rosalind tells, it's nice. It's good to know that they had some wolves, I think, to shoot the film, but some of they didn't have enough, so they used German shepherds, right? Shepherd dogs.
Yep.
And we also saw one at the beginning, like running through the woods, which is, important for the ending. And yeah, I just like, that most of the wolf scenes in the woods are shot at night, essentially, because you can see, their eyes glowing, yellow and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a very cool. I think it's quite a cool cinematographic trick. That even though they're clearly just dogs, that I don't know how they do it, but the eyes do seem to glow. Like, for a low budget film, they really do it well, I think. It really does hold up.
And what I find weird is, like, when they shoot the wolf in the woods, like, the boy, he's coming with them, and then when they are at the trap that they set for it, someone's shooting, and he's looking, like, through the legs of one of the guys. So essentially, it's really, it's sort of a bit laughable, but in a good way. But yeah, as you say, the paw turns out to be a hand in the end, which is strange. Which would be strange, but not in this film, because we've already been introduced to the idea of werewolves. And
yeah, I mean, by this point, we're so far into the weirdness. I mean, it starts off weird and it gets weirder.
Yeah. No, but what I find interesting is that as opposed to the father treating it as something like casual, which you would expect, because the film already is used to the idea of werewolves, the father is still, like, very much disturbed by that idea. So the audience would likely be too, because I mean, if the characters are relaxed about it, then the audience has no reason to feel any tension. And so I think it's important that the characters themselves treat it as if they don't know what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And that films like this, because it can be a bit ludicrous, I guess, to modern eyes. You have to have everyone within it treat it with absolutely a straight face, otherwise it just descends into camp, sort of the worst excesses of Hammer horror, I guess.
And you also see sometimes shots of Rosalind, like, in her sleep, like there are some tears dropping, Yeah,
and I guess we're meant to think that maybe this is all just part of the original sleeping Rosalind's dream.
Yeah,
like, you just never know what level of reality you're working on in this film.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, in a sign that Rosalind is manning up ever since telling her little story and discovering the wolf inside herself, I guess, she now, the next day, decides to go off to Granny's house, but this time she's actually armed. She's got a big fat knife, and she's got food and drink, and I guess this is the bit from the actual Little Red Riding Hood fairy tale.
And she's got no bow, She's got a knife, like in the Sondheim Into the Woods, right? Where she skins the wolf with a knife. But it's here. I also like the idea that basically, she doesn't have to necessarily experience something dramatic in order to change. I mean, it's merely a different perspective that she has now, as a result of hearing from her mother and from the people around her. So it's a very natural thing. It's not some forced plot event that changes her.
True.
And so that
although maybe you could link it to kissing the boy, I guess.
Yeah, I mean that's something that you could expect in a everyday setting, right? It's not some weird attack by werewolf or something that.
Even though he does then become a werewolf and go on the attack, but that's afterwards.
Yeah, but that's not even the boy. That's someone else.
Yeah.
So she goes into the woods.
She goes into the woods and she meets, and I think this is one of the most fascinating characters, the huntsman whose eyebrows meet in the middle. So this is clearly the big confrontation of the film. And then it's really weird because despite the fact that she's armed up and she knows she shouldn't, she does agree to have a picnic with him. And
he talks about his compass, which is the most... I've got the most extraordinary object in my pocket. It's like the weird line from Mr. Burns and Smithers, like, Smithers, I have a rocket in my pocket. It's, that sort of, the dialogue has a lot of sexual innuendo, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. It's lascivious.
And he basically, I also like the concept of merging the wolf with the huntsman, because that means that there's no one else to rescue her when, because otherwise in the traditional fairy tale, the huntsman kills the wolf and frees Red Riding Hood and the grandmother. But here, the huntsman is the wolf. So who is there to save Rosalind from death? And it turns out it's herself. So very much.
Yeah, and people think Frozen is all modern and whatnot. This shit was 1984. But anyway, so they have this bizarre wager where he says he's going to use his pocket compass, Mrs., to race her to her granny's house and that he'll get there before her, and if he does, that she has to give him a kiss. So I know. So basically, they both go off to find Granny's cottage. He obviously gets there first, and when Rosaline turns up, I think she realizes that Granny's been murdered because she's not there and there's blood, and she realizes that she's been burned in the fire, I think, from memory. And it's just really disgusting, basically.
Grandmother basically knocks him over. We see his, big wolf tongue come out, right? And it's really strange and weird. And then he knocks her head off, and it sort of bursts into a million pieces, like a doll's head, basically. And he basically waits for Red Riding Hood, like in Granny's chair, like. And
it's weird though, because in the book, I suppose you're meant to think, or in the fairy tale, you're meant to think that this is a bad thing, that he's killed Granny, but because Granny has been this force of basically prejudice and oppression, are we meant to think of it as a good thing in the film? I don't know.
I would say that it could be both. It could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. We're not. We're not sure. It depends on where we end up on the sort of sexual politics of the thing. So. I still think the grandmother character is essentially a good person in the film.
A product of her time, basically. She's trying to do the right thing, but equipped only with the prejudices of her time, I guess.
And what I enjoy is when basically he's waiting for her to show up, for Rosalind to show up. Like he's rocking the chair, and so it's like you just see the yellow eyes, like it's and. We have to mention the music as well, which I find is just, George Fenton doing music, which is, he did also Les Liaisons Dangereuses with John Malkovich and Glenn Close.
Yeah, he's amazing, isn't he? What I find amazing in this film, which I'd sort of forgotten until I watched it, was that he goes from everything from this very sort of contemporary 1980s synth music, and then he does the kind of Mozart pastiche for the Aristo story, and then he does these real fairy tale type, like dark melodramatic music, and he also does organ heavy horror. It's very kind of flexible, and it's almost just like as many tropes as Angela Carter's borrowing and Neil Jordan's borrowing from history, that he's also matching them sound for sound. It's really impressive.
And now when Rosalind arrives at the cottage, essentially the moon, like she looks at the moon and it turns red, which is like always a bad sign. But it's to me it's interesting also because the huntsman basically said earlier, why should I be frightened of the wolves, right? It's sort of the idea that the unknown is what you fear. Once you know it, once you've grown accustomed to it, there's no reason to resent it or fear it.
But again, it's knowledge and enlightenment versus prejudice and dark ages. So the wolf, although the baddie of the fairy tale in this case, is I guess the force of the Enlightenment. Or you can interpret it that way.
It's like it's sort of the idea of the devil being also a very seductive character. So he has to be at least you have to be able to believe that someone would fall for those ideas somehow, and so they have to be made somewhat reasonable to someone. Otherwise, it's unlikely that you would ever, make a pact with the devil, so to speak.
Well, he's got the moves, hasn't he? Because shortly after killing her granny and knowing that she realizes he's done this, he does try and get her to take off her clothes and put them in the fire.
And he says she should burn the red scarf because that's essentially the thing that's keeping her down, right? It's essentially the idea of innocence, of childhood innocence that she has to burn in the fire, and yeah, she basically tells him, that she assumes that he's devoured the grandmother, and
shoots him with a gun, but accidentally on purpose misses him.
Yeah, and he sort of then he becomes more of a sympathetic figure in a way because he's frightened of the gun, and he tells her that he essentially has no identity, that he sort of switches between the man and the wolf, but that he actually doesn't belong to any one of those, which is rather sad because it also singles out the isolation that people who obviously are very liberated sexually would obviously, they would feel that isolation in that historical context, I think, because
I agree.
It's a very, as we said, it's a very repressive sexual culture that they are living in. So it's I think that's what it represents. Essentially, it's also interesting because he's wearing white and she's wearing red. So
absolutely, it's all been inverted, hasn't it? And the wolf who, in the opening scene, when chasing the little girl in the nightmare, evidently to her death, is a violent person, and now suddenly he's vulnerable, he's in pain, transformed by the fact that she's kissed him because he won the bet, but it's kind of undone him because she uses that to shoot him. And then she then tells him the story about how a female werewolf in human form sought help from a priest, and he took pity on her and bandaged her wound and let her return to her old world. So it's almost like the first two stories are totally about male domination and fearing males, and then suddenly it's all about women being not just those who call the males out in terms of justice, but actually can be healers and who can prompt pity and mercy. So it's a total turnaround, really. Basically.
Yeah, the man in that story is much more merciful and kind because he's also the priest in the story, right? He's supposed to be because he doesn't care essentially that she's from the wild. He's because he tells her that it's that doesn't matter that if she is a creature of I think,
which is deeply Christian, I guess. And it's kind of interesting that you've got in Granny's Prejudice, priests are basically all these sort of feckless, wanton people who have bastard it's so common for a priest to have a bastard that you can have legends about it, but suddenly here you have a priest actually as an agent of humanity, which is kind of nice, I guess.
And also I like the idea of she comes from the world, she goes to the world above and then she returns to the world below, which has that really a feel of the underworld and sort of something coming out of a pit essentially. It's like the but not necessarily something horrible. It's just something that's strange and different from everything else. I sort of like the idea of the imagery that it creates, and I think we should also maybe say that we haven't mentioned the transformation scene.
Go for it.
Yeah, because essentially, he tells her, she says, he gets, his shirt off, and she says, what big arms you have, right? And he says, all the better to hug you with. And it's sort of the play on the Red Riding Hood story.
All the better to eat
you says, Jesus, what big teeth you have. And he says, all the better to eat you with. And then she basically...
What a big compass you have.
Yeah, well, and so then he transforms essentially, and what happens is, he's obviously in agony, right? And then when he sits up, the snout of the wolf comes out of his mouth, right? It's like really this strange because it's the idea of changing your skin, so it's on the inside, as they've said that at different occasions in the film as well, and yeah, so the wolf sort of pushes out of the skin. Essentially, it's not the same way that we've seen it at the beginning when we were told the first story about the husband, isn't? But it's different, and that's what I think that's why I also like the film, is essentially because it doesn't stick to one thing. It doesn't repeat itself. So
I agree.
On where you say, "Oh, I've seen it once. I know what is about to happen or how it's about to look." Nope. This is practical effects.
But also, it makes a difference, because the first time you hear the transformation story, it's Granny telling the story, whereas this time it's Rosalind's story. So it kind of makes sense that they would imagine it or see it differently, because it's two different narrators. And it's almost like two different film directors are showing you what they're seeing. So I think it's just really neat in a way.
He's got that big tongue that always comes out.
Oh,
it's like, also something very, very, very sexual.
Evidently. So
like
basically...
He's Jon Snow, basically. He knows what to do with his tongue. So.
Oh, yeah. Oh, God, cheap joke. Anyway, so...
Yeah, anyway, moving on. This was brilliant special effects for the time, and I think that one holds up better than the previous one. So
I don't think either of them hold up hugely well, though, in fairness.
But what I like is then you have essentially a real wolf in the same room with Rosalind, right? Because that does not look like a shepherd dog. That looks like a real wolf, actually. And yeah, we sort of, after her story, essentially what happens is there's a
basically, the search party arrives at Granny's house looking for Rosaline.
Yes.
And basically all they find is a wolf wearing her crucifix, and Rosaline's mother, who we know has been the one who gave her the idea that women can have a free sexuality, stops the party from shooting Rosaline because she realises that that's her daughter. And then Rosaline, the wolf, runs into the night with the other wolves. So basically... it's as though Rosaline's discovered her sexuality and has chosen the world of freedom rather than small-town prejudice. And then the wolves kind of run into the real world that we started off with and sort of crash through into the original sleeping girl's window. So she wakes in the modern world and screams.
And it's likely that they eat her also, right?
Yeah, exactly. But it's a really... I love the ending, because the first half of this movie is so dark and sort of misogynistic, and it ends with this girl basically empowering herself and saying it's fine to run free and enlightened.
Yeah, and they're not, that's also the idea of the wolves here. They're sort of a pack of wolves, right? They're not isolated creatures here. Exactly,
so it's not a lonely and marginalized outsider life, Yeah, exactly.
And this is progress ripping through the walls, right? It's
quite literally.
And some of them you recognize as dogs, right? They're not, but some of them actually look like real wolves. So it's.
But I love the parallel between this concept of losing your physical virginity, but also losing your intellectual virginity in a way. Like the ripping through of sort of Enlightenment thought from prejudice is really powerful. So that's why I've always loved this film.
And it feels like, at least, from at the beginning, we see the one wolf running through the woods, as I mentioned earlier. And it feels like, to me, that, the wolf essentially comes from a different time. It feels like it's running through time and space. And it's there to, it arrives at this point and, crashing through the window. And all the dolls fall on the floor, right? And then we have the original fairy tale's moral being given to us, right? And I also like it because we don't see what's happening to Rosalind, but we get essentially, also the idea that that this is about sexual predators as well, right? It's not just about sexuality. It's also the idea of yeah, sex being, it can be a good thing, but also a very violent thing and a destructive thing. So
Absolutely. So have you seen the recent Catherine Hardwicke movie Red Riding Hood starring Amanda Seyfried?
No, I have not, because I've been told that it's not good, so I haven't bothered with it, sadly enough.
Okay, I got quite excited when that was coming out. I thought, oh, it'll be interesting to see a modern take on this, and then it just, yeah, like you say, I mean, really nice production values, but basically, and the medieval kind of village peasanty prejudicey setting, but it just missed a trick so badly. It's a shame.
And the only good thing I heard was Gary Oldman in it. And Gary Oldman has also played, he's played a vampire before, and he's also had a scene as a wolf, kind of.
Yeah, well, he kind of plays the kind of from memory, the prejudicial priest, but
yes, which is strange, given not necessarily strange, because he's also kind of the antagonist figure. Gary Oldman, he plays all the villains.
Yeah, but, I mean he's a bit typecast in a way, but it's not a great film, although it looks, in a sense, it does look very fairy tale and beautiful, but like they get all the visual iconography, it's just very ham-fisted when it comes to the sexual undercurrents. It's a real shame. Also, more laughably, are you aware of the Roald Dahl, his revolting tales? His little... Oh
yeah, I've read one short story where there's a woman who basically whose husband has an accident, and he's sort of a brain. The only thing that's left is the brain and the eyes, and so she keeps it in a jar.
Because he actually has a little Red Riding Hood and the wolf story that totally...
Oh, I haven't read that one.
Really?
But I think it would be in there probably. I've just read some of the short stories in there.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I can read you a couple of lines that give you the impression of. Yeah. Anyway, so the little Red Riding Hood said, "But Grandma, what a lovely, great big fairy coat you have on." "That's wrong," cried the wolf. "Have you forgot to tell me what big teeth I've got?" "Oh well, no matter what you say, I'm going to eat you anyway." The small girl smiles, one eyelid flickers. She whips a pistol from her knickers. She aims it at the creature's head, and bang, 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 she shoots him dead. A few weeks later, in the wood, I came across Miss Riding Hood. But what a change! No cloak of red, no silly hood upon her head. She said, "Hello, and do please note my lovely furry wolfskin coat." It just goes to show that this kind of revisionism had started well before Angela Carter.
Yeah, I mean, the same kind of thing happens also in the Sondheim musical Into the Woods, where essentially after Red Riding Hood gets saved from the wolf, she makes a coat out of wolf skin, right? And yeah,
absolutely,
she kills a lot of other wolves essentially, because apparently she becomes like the sort of the violent youth, street gang-ish kind of type. So it's like really the idea of revision, like is Red Riding Hood doesn't need any protection, because she's got a knife, and that's what she's gonna use.
But I think what's interesting about this particular retelling is I think lots of people have taken the obvious retelling, which is to make Little Red Riding Hood like really fierce and that she'll just kill the wolf. I think this is one of the rare ones where she kind of becomes the wolf in a way, or appropriates the nature of the wolf. I think it's just far more interesting to that respect. Are there any other versions that you think of that are really notable?
Let's see. The only thing, I mean, it's not necessarily a Red Riding Hood story, but I mentioned Bram Stoker's Dracula, right?
Yeah.
Where there's a scene where essentially, Lucy goes out into the night because she's, hypnotized or whatever, and then there's this wolf-like figure, this wolfman type figure that sort of sexually assaults her and bites her on the neck and that sort of thing, and she's wearing red, which I find really, that obviously has to come back. I mean, it sort of feels like that's a reference to Red Riding Hood as well, which I find really striking, because it's sort of linked to the idea of the connection between vampires and werewolves, and I really like that aspect of it, because it's very fluid.
I mean, it does feel like there's lots of Red Riding Hoods. It does feel like there's lots of Red Riding Hoods in media where it's obvious that rather than have her innocent, they make her kind of a bit sketchy. So like in Shrek, Little Red Riding Hood's the pickpocket, and there was even it's a really good film actually. Ellen Page from Inception.
Oh yeah, she did the hard candy, didn't she?
Yeah, and it's kind of weird because it's not really used in the film as a metaphor, but in the advertising poster, she was this sort of young teenage girl who basically takes vengeance on a man she perceives to be a paedophile, and the advertising campaign had her wearing a red hoodie, and a lot of people were saying, "Oh yeah, this is kind of a Red Riding Hood signal," even though I didn't really think it was. But it was interesting that it's such a powerful visual metaphor that people want to appropriate it even when it's not really truly there a little bit.
Yeah, I know that's true. Other Red Riding Hood stories that I've heard about, it's strange because that would have been a likely story for Disney to adapt at some point, right? If you would have thought they might do that, but maybe not. I think that there's lots of material where you can probably see the story being used as an inspiration to something else. Freeway with Reese Witherspoon.
Oh, I haven't seen that. Is that
it's about but that's the sort of messed up story of Red Riding Hood in modern day, basically, where she wants to get to her grandmother. Because her mother is a meth head who gets arrested at the beginning, and so with a father who sexually abused Reese Witherspoon's character, and so she wants to get into her grandmother. And yeah, is it Kiefer Sutherland? I'm not sure who plays the wolf in this, but it's I'm just gonna check very quickly because it's actually it's one of my favorites because it's so interesting. I think there's a lot of they transpose it. For example, the forest is prison in the film.
Okay.
Because that's the place where she toughens up, essentially, and she meets up with these girls in prison, and actually, she shoots the wolf character pretty early in the film, and he then sues her in court. And she says, look who's been beat with the ugly stick. She has a southern accent or something. And she's like, I don't know. It's sort of a dark comedy,
okay,
in a way, because I think the wolf is Kiefer Sutherland, who has played villains before.
No shit, yeah.
Yeah. So.
Cool.
But it's really strange because at the end, it's sort of like he's killed her grandma, and she says, "Yeah, you fucker, you killed my grandma." It's like, I don't know. It's really strange because you're sort of at a remove of it, and he's sort of playing this serial killer who is also like into porn and that sort of thing.
Wonderful.
Yeah. No, but that's sort of that's. One of the Red Riding Hood adaptations, you could say.
Okay, cool.
That's more for adults because,
Well, I think they all are, aren't they, really? Unless you're in the very basic fairytale level. I mean, the only way to do it in an interesting way is it's clearly a metaphor about sort of sexual violence, so evidently
that's what the original story was about, right? It's about, not trusting strangers, who might want, who essentially can harm you, right? It's sort of this cautionary tale.
But is it though? Because I think actually it's almost the opposite. It's almost like creating. I mean, yes, there would be a sensible cautionary tale about not trusting strangers, which would be fine. But I think Little Red Riding Hood is such a level of paranoia that it's almost like creating this imaginary threat to keep women scared and in their place. Like it goes above and beyond just basic caution.
I mean, I could see that, but at the same time, the huntsman is a stranger as well, but he saves, Red Riding Hood and the grandmother because he's a stranger who is kind and good-hearted, right?
Although you'll note that the original fairy tale doesn't tell you how to tell the difference between the two.
Not necessarily. Yeah.
So what use is it?
Sure. I mean, but the thing is, it's about because the wolf essentially tempts her to get the flowers, and wait and essentially waste her time while he sprints to the grandmother's house and eats her. Right? It's sort of the idea of he's much more, he's much more talk, and he's not, he's not demonstrated by action that he's actually trustworthy, whereas the huntsman doesn't need to, he just doesn't need to explain himself. He's just, he just does the right thing essentially. But yeah, he's not. I mean, that's just my interpretation. I know that there's a lot of, you can always, and that's what I find so interesting about this film that we just discussed. It's, there are different ways of looking at it. If you are in a specific mood or or if you have a specific mindset, it's open to interpretation in a way that I feel like other versions of Red Riding Hood are not, because they essentially like to tell you out loud, no, this is good, this is bad,
But also to simplify it, because actually when you read the original, Brothers Grimm or the Sharper or whichever version you're reading, it is a slippery tale. And a lot of these original fairy tales, when you go back to the actual sort of they're oral folk tales, aren't they? But if you go down to the original sort of written sources by the Brothers Grimm or whoever, they're very short. And because they're very short, they're incredibly, there's giant gaps around them that you can weave any kind of interpretation into. Mm-hmm. And even Angela Carter, what I love about her is when she's rewriting them, she still keeps her short stories very short and still keeps that kind of evasive nature. I think that's how fairy tales should be. They should be very open to people layering things onto them. And that's probably why we both love this film, right? Because it has that. And, whether it's my 1 hour, 20 minute version or your 1 hour, 35 minute version, that's still very short by modern movie making, standards. So, and, huge swathes of it are just surreal dream sequences. So, the actual narrative content is even shorter. So and I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to have lots of plot. It just has to engage you on some level. And I think the film succeeds because it's much more focusing on theme than on story. Because the story is or mood even. It's one of the most evocative. I think it's the movie that best encapsulates what it feels to be in a nightmare. Which it must be an incredibly hard thing to do because it's different for everyone, but this movie really gets it.
Because it's like, the dream sequences, there are moments where they're really light, and almost like upbeat, essentially, especially when Rosalind is in the town. And then there are moments where it slips, there's one step off the path, essentially, where it slips into the much more gothically unnerving, and the strangeness of it all. And I like the fact that it takes just a second to get from one atmosphere to the other, because there's a line that the film walks right in the middle, and so it can always like choose to go left or right whenever it needs to.
Absolutely.
And I think that's why I feel. If I were to say, this is, if this was a book that was adapted straight, if this was a story that was written in a book as it was told in the film, I would have said, there's value to that, because not every story has to be plot driven. I mean, if you have something to say on something like sexuality, and the role of men and women in society, and I don't know if there's a role actually, but I mean, just to say, that, you know, if there's an opinion on a subject, there's a way to tell that, and it doesn't necessarily have to be within the constraints of a 3-act structure, you know, in a tightly woven narrative.
Yeah, and it's weird because we mustn't give people who haven't watched this film the impression that it's not plot driven, because in a bizarre way the movie is full of plot. It's got stories within stories within stories, but
Yes.
it's just that in a sense what matters is the mood, and there are so many stories but they're kind of conflicting in the morality that they're giving us, and it's a movie that makes you work and it's a movie that makes you feel, which is quite rare to have both. And it makes you work at thinking what you're really being presented and what they're trying to tell you. So it's what makes it really, despite the hokey, well, what I would perceive to be some of the hokey effects in retrospect, I think it still really holds up. And like there are some of those images, like the
wolves in the forest, right?
The wolves in the forest and the wolf's head falling into the pail of milk, that are so, they really stick with you. I mean, even before I rewatched it today, I hadn't seen it for about 10 years, and I could really very clearly see those images. So, you know, kudos to the film for doing that, basically, which is probably a really nice positive note on which to end this discussion review, as I think we're also almost at the running time of the film. Yeah. So with that, this has kind of been a weird little pantheon discussion, but I want to really thank Matthieu for suggesting it, because it's a great film, and any reason to revisit it's a good one. So thank you for joining. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed that sort of slightly odd episode of B007 Movie Reviews. And if you want to check out Company of Wolves, it's available on various DVD formats. You can download it on iTunes, and it's, I'm sure, in some other dodgy versions, available on YouTube as well. Thank you for listening.